Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Spotlight video. This week, what we're going to look at is how do you develop strong qualitative research questions, and what does alignment look like in your qualitative research study and how you design it. So starting with research questions, why are they so hard to write? I cannot tell you how many of my doctoral students get lost for weeks in just trying to figure out how do I articulate what I am interested in studying. And it is frustrating and it is really, really difficult. And some of the reasons are, first of all, your research question or questions are going to guide the design of your study and all of your methodological choices. So they have a lot of power and it feels like a really big commitment. And in that, when you are able to articulate your question, you are narrowing your focus, and therefore it often requires letting go. And so I think a lot of us have really big ideas about what we want to accomplish in our research studies, and we have to remember that we can't do everything. And so sometimes we just have to be willing to let it go. Maybe you are going to continue and study that portion later on in a subsequent study, or maybe you're going to allow someone else to do that portion of a study or a specific question. It's also important because what we know is low quality research questions can lead to a low quality study. It's kind of the idea of garbage in, garbage out. So we want to make sure we have high quality questions so that we can have a much stronger study. Also keep in mind that in qualitative research, your research questions can change along the way. And so I know it is hard to commit to a question or several questions, but know that they are your starting point. They are your guiding questions that can change along the way. So before developing your question, here are some things you need to think about. First of all, you need to be very familiar with the literature base. Unless you are doing a grounded theory study, which might ask you to do a little bit less upfront, for most studies, you want to make sure that you know what is out there. And in chapter 6 of your textbook this week, it's really going to help you understand that, this literature is going to help you identify your problem statement or the issue that really needs to be addressed, and your purpose statement within that. So what you plan on accomplishing, what your objectives are within this bigger issue or bigger problem that's going on in the world. And then that purpose statement is going to guide you to your research questions. So it's kind of like that funnel of like a larger field of literature, and then your purpose within that, what you hope to accomplish, and then your research questions will fit within that. So you do need to be familiar with the literature base to at least a certain extent before you can fully develop your research questions. The other thing that can be helpful is trying some writing exercises. And so I provided a range of exercises for you to consider. Maybe you can include those in your research journal, just to think about, to kind of help you brainstorm, help you narrow down, help you focus your attention on what you really are interested in asking about your area. So are you ready to actually draft a question now? You might be saying to yourself, no, I am not. But guess what? This week you are ready to draft a question, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's going to be a starting point. As you are developing your research question, one of the things you should start thinking about is to be clear on what you want to understand. Your question should reflect your study's purpose. So if you are having a conversation with someone and they're like, well, what do you want to study? And whatever your response is, that's usually kind of close to what your purpose is, what you're hoping to make sense of by the end of your study. And so whatever you say your purpose is, your research question should match that, should align with that. So let's say you are interested in the many factors and circumstances that might explain children's school attendance. So if you're saying I'm interested in factors and different circumstances that influence that, you really are thinking kind of ecologically about a child's world and what can inform their attendance, from, housing to transportation to healthcare, a variety of factors. But then let's say your question says, how does student attendance vary across students in an elementary school? Well, this doesn't really get at the factors and circumstances that might come up, but it really isn't explicit in your question, and it needs to be. So a higher quality question would be, what community and familial factors influence students' attendance and engagement in an elementary school? And that more closely matches your purpose. Another thing to consider is your research question should avoid assumptions. So it shouldn't be leading in any way. Let's say you are interested in students' social skills post-COVID. I think we all are if you work with children. And you ask the question, why have students' social skills declined since COVID? Well, this is not a neutral question in any way. You're putting it out there that you believe social skills have declined. This question makes more sense with a mixed method study. And let's say your quantitative portion of the study did show, hey, we are documenting some level of decline in certain social skills or social skills more globally. And then your qualitative portion might be explanatory to help explain that. But if you're just going in with a general qualitative study, what might make more sense and would be a higher quality question is, how do teachers describe students' social skills pre and post-COVID? And therefore, you're not kind of leading in any way or making assumptions. Another thing to consider is your research questions tell us about the population and or context of the study. And that is important because you do need some level of specificity in your question. Otherwise, you might not be able to fully answer your question if it is too broad. And so an example of this might be someone who is wondering about high school students' access to or involvement with after-school activities. So if they're interested in that, and then they ask the question, how do schools support extracurricular activities? I look at that question and I say, wow, this is a huge question. And I'm wondering how you're even going to fully answer this, because are we talking about all schools? Are we talking about preschool, elementary, middle school, high school? Are we talking about schools in suburban settings, rural settings, urban settings? There are just so many things that could be, that this question could encompass. And that is way too much for one study. So an example that you might be able to use instead would be, how do rural high school students support extracurricular activities and involvement? And in this question, now I know there are some parameters on the study and more focus in the question and then how you can go about answering it. So first of all, I know this is about rural communities. So for me as a reader, that helps me to know, okay, what community are you going to be talking about? Now I know we're focusing on high schools. Okay, so now I know the level of education. And then that can lead to, who might be included. You could be looking at teachers, administrators, students, family members, community members, faculty, sponsors, or coaches in the way that it's framed. So it does create some parameters and helps you narrow in on what you will be able to answer as part of the study. So the AG article is really helpful this week in helping you refine your questions and think about what should be included, what should be avoided. And so this is a great place to start. So maybe start doing some of those writing exercises and then read this article as you start to draft your question or questions. Also know that your research question is very much intertwined with your methodology. So you are going to be learning about some different methodologies this week: phenomenology, ethnography, case study, grounded theory, and narrative. This is not exhaustive. There are other ways in which you can go about studying people, but these are probably the main ones that you will see in educational research. And so your research question and how it's framed will lead to some certain methodologies. So maybe the way that you phrase a question, it might make more sense that, oh, okay, this could, link to phenomenology or a case study. Now, if you are someone that you are really fully committed to a certain methodology and you're going to do a narrative study or you are going to do a case study, that's completely fine. But know that that needs to be reflected in your research question. The two need to match because they are interconnected. So that leads us to thinking about alignment. So your research question is really leading the charge, and it needs to then align with your interpretive framework or your research paradigm, which we talked about last week, which also needs to fit with your guiding theory, and then your methodology, and then your methods, because methodology and methods are different. There are methods that fit within methodologies, and we'll be learning about those next week. But all of these need to align to make for a strong study. So let's think about how there could be some misalignment in a study. So let's say someone's research question is about power and decision-making in education. And their interpretive framework or paradigm is critical theory. That makes sense, right? Because it is about, power. And the guiding theory, then they talk about using Vygotsky and Piaget as their main theorists in the study. Well, that would make me pause right there because Vygotsky and Piaget are constructivists. So you would have a lot of defending of this choice to do if you wanted me to believe that this theory is the best choice or these theories are the best choice if you are asking a question about power and you are coming from the lens of critical theory. So I would probably say, hey, let's pause. Let's think is this the theory that's guiding you, or maybe there's some other individuals that would make more sense if this is the route that you're going. Another example might be a research question related to how a new curriculum is integrated across a district. And then the interpretive framework you explain is social constructivism. Okay, that makes sense, that works. And then your guiding theory is the work of Bruner. That makes sense because also going along with constructivism. And then your methodology is narrative. And I might pause at that point and just say, not what I was expecting. Because what we know about narrative methodology, it's about telling stories of individual experiences. So if your research question was about the stories of maybe curricular changes in the district, or someone's story related to kind of curricular decisions that they're making, that might make sense. But the way that this is framed and looking at it from kind of a social constructivist perspective, it might make more sense to, say, okay, then my methodology is grounded theory or case study or ethnography. So that one would make me pause as well, because it doesn't seem like everything aligns. Another example might be someone has a research question related to middle school identities, and their interpretive framework or their paradigm is queer theory, and the guiding theorist is the work of Butler, and then their methodology is ethnography. All of this is making sense to me, right? But then we get to methods. And the person writes about that their primary methods then to answer their questions within ethnography is to focus on observations and document review. And I would pause there, and I would be a little surprised by these choices, mainly because when we think about queer theory, it's about voices and experiences of individuals who have been suppressed. So you're not allowing for really voices that, would come out in other forms. Instead, you're using your own lens through observation and document review. So this would really fight against your interpretive framework, as well as ethnography, and not incorporating more. So what might make more sense if you see this alignment here in that final box, using, yes, observations can be fine, but also incorporating like photo elicitation interviews where maybe they are taking pictures of things linked to their identity and talking about them, maybe some focus groups with students, looking at some student writing. That would make much more sense and align with all of your decisions and the research question. So this week, this is what you're going to start thinking about, the alignment. As you are drafting your research question, it should fit with your interpretive framework or paradigm, or at least maybe help you focus in on one or two that you talked about last week that maybe you felt most connected with. And your guiding theory. Now, depending on where you are at in the program, you may feel somewhat committed to certain theories. So making sure this fits with them, with all of these pieces up to this point, or maybe you need to start thinking, are there other theories that are more important or might align better with that research question? And then this week will also help you think about the methodologies that might be most relevant to your research question and your interpretive framework. And then next week, we'll talk about the methods that might fit within that. So one thing I always say to students is be kind to your reader. So as you are starting to draft things up, and I know kind of the most writing goes on during our final week of class, please just be kind to your reader. It is helpful to remind your reader about the research questions and how you are addressing it or them throughout the paper. So remind me in every section. So you're going to talk about your research question probably towards the beginning of your paper. Remind me when you are talking about your paradigm or interpretive framework and how that fits with your research question. Then when you talk about methodology, remind me what your research question or questions are and how this fits with them. When you talk about your methods, remind me how this fits with your research questions and helping to answer those. Not only is that helpful for your reader, because it's a lot of pages, and although you're very familiar with the questions, your reader can forget, but it also helps you, because it holds you accountable for really making sure that all of these pieces fit together. And it can help you make your alignment really explicit in your writing. So for this week, you are going to be reading chapters 3, 4, and 6 in the Creswell book, looking at different methodologies and looking at research questions and the purpose of your study. The AG article will help you drafting your research questions. You are also going to pick an article of your choice, whatever topic you're interested in. Please find an article that uses one of the methodologies that we'll look at this week. And then there is a qualitative research process table. It's just a little kind of PDF that helps you understand how research questions can change along the way. You'll also continue to journal You'll submit your research question and you'll have your peer discussion and discussion post. Thanks so much.